Hello. This training series on child exposure to domestic violence was developed by the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare and the Minnesota Center Against Violence and Abuse at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work. This training module is an introduction to assessment interviews with children exposed to domestic violence. After completing this training on assessment of children exposed to domestic violence, you should have a deeper understanding of the goals and purpose of completing a comprehensive assessment of child exposure. You should also be able to develop questions to use in your own assessments with children and have a deeper understanding about protecting and using the information you collect. This training is intended to be an overview of assessment and the primary areas that you would want to consider when working with a child. Assessment can often seem like a broad undertaking. These goals are something to keep in mind as we continue to discuss the nuances of conducting an assessment. First, it's important to leave space for the child to tell his or her story. Depending on the type of assessment technique you use, this is accomplished in different ways. Remember as you are completing forms and assessment sheets that you can gather more information by tuning into the story the child is telling you. For many child welfare and community workers, safety assessment is key and the main focus of assessment. Trying to tap into and understand the meaning that children assigned to violence in their home is important in understanding the overall risk and potential areas for work with a practitioner. Children use a variety of coping strategies. Coping strategies and strengths can be lost in an assessment if you focus solely on the deficits and risks in the family. Finally, focusing on strengths is just as important as understanding the risks. The strengths that are already present in a family or child are the resources they will draw upon in their ongoing efforts to create safe and stable environments in which to live. Children are not passively exposed to the violence in their homes, but rather are always taking in information and trying to assign meaning to the events. Isaacovitz and Winstock in 2001 described children's construction of domestic violence in terms of cyclical stages of understanding, starting with recollection, then causality, and finally moralization. These stages are not necessarily linear, and children may move between them when new violent events occur. The first stage, recollection, refers to children coping with the events by recalling and denying various aspects of a particular event or circumstance. The second stage, causality, refers to the child trying to determine why the event happened, and the child will pick up cues from other family members. Lastly, the moralization stage refers to the child assigning meaning to the event. Elements of all three stages may be explored in your assessment with the child. Next, we will show an autobiographical digital story composed and produced by Jamie, a young survivor of domestic violence exposure. In this story, she talks about her life in a home where domestic violence was frequent.
I was born on January 1, 1967, in the year of the horse and under the sign of Capricorn. I was born to an alcoholic mother the day after the biggest drinking day of the year. It's hard to say when my mom became an alcoholic. She told me two stories about it. One was that she ran away from her Fairbanks, Alaska home at age 12, and in order to eat, she sold newspapers on the street. One particularly freezing day, she went into a bar to sell the papers. Some drunks took pity on her, bought them all, and a drink to warm her up. My biological father died when I was 2, and in 1970, my half-brother was born. Ever since I was 3, the only dad I knew was Thomas Alfred Green. He was a very bad man. I know that people like to say that men who commit domestic violence are just men who are hurting, but fuck that. There's no other way to say it than to say this man was a monster. My earliest memory of Dad is the night he took a knife to my mother. I was 3. I remember getting out of bed and walking towards the kitchen. I saw my mother cowering in a corner, and my father with a large butcher knife. I'll always wonder how I knew how to play it that night, how I knew not to scream or run or react. Instead, I just walked up to my dad and innocently asked, "Daddy, can you put me to bed?" He seemed to break out of some kind of trance. He put the knife down, took my hand, put me to bed, and kissed me on the forehead before he left. I lay awake for hours, hearing my mother still crying. I knew not to risk getting up again to be with her comforting me comforting her. Neither was an option, and of course, the next day we never spoke of it. This was the pattern for most of my adolescence. My dad would beat my mom with a fist, a broom, a brush, a vacuum, his words, and we never spoke of it. Over the years, he broke her jaw twice, her ribs, her arms, and her nose. And on one especially vicious night, he crushed her skull on the front steps to our apartment. My mother would come home in a cast, in bandages. She would drink her meals out of a straw. She had regular blackened eyes, and by age 30, all of her teeth had been knocked out. We never talked about it. For years I walked up and down on those stairs bloodied by my mother's bashed-in head, and we never talked about it. My dad is still alive, I think. He lives in Las Vegas, owns a home, and the last I heard, my mom was homeless in Oklahoma. Here's a daughter's biggest guilt and my biggest wound. This month marks 10 years since I've had contact with my mother. I chose to save myself, and I had to leave her. I had to leave her to save myself. My mom eventually did leave my dad, but unfortunately she continued to drink, and her life became more and more out of control and dangerous. She was broken by alcohol, by society, by poverty, by men. And I had to let her go so that I wouldn't live broken too. It was the hardest decision I ever had to make. And it's the hardest decision I've ever had to keep.
Please take a few minutes to read the questions on the screen and reflect on Jamie's story. When you are ready, advance to the next slide. The assessment techniques you use will depend on the type of work you are doing with the family. Structured interviews and assessment tools are useful and appropriate if you do not have an extended period of time for an assessment or if you do not have an established relationship with the family. This is often the case for child welfare investigators who must make an assessment in a short period of time with limited information. Assessment tools such as the Child Exposure to Domestic Violence Scale, referred to as the CEDV scale, can gather a large amount of information in a short period of time that can be expanded in ongoing discussions with the child during child welfare assessments or in clinical practice. This learning module will focus on the use of structured interviews. Subsequent trainings will focus on the use of the CEDV scale. Child interviews allow you to take a broader look at the level of functioning of the child compared to paper and pencil questionnaires or projective techniques, including drawing and storytelling. You may choose to use both and start with a paper and pencil test or projective techniques such as drawing pictures and storytelling to broach the subject of family violence and also examine the level of comfort or resistance the child has to talking about the violence. Drawing and storytelling techniques will be discussed in further detail later in this module. The space you use for an interview or assessment with a child should be very intentional. Oftentimes, interviews may be happening in the context of a crisis, such as at a domestic violence shelter or shortly after an arrest. Remember that anxiety for children is likely to be high while talking to you about very private and emotionally charged issues. Children may have been explicitly told by their parents not to talk about the violence in their home. Confidential spaces are key to successfully working with a child. For example, waiting rooms for parents should be clearly out of earshot of the interview room. Even if you know the space is soundproof, the perception of confidentiality and privacy is very important for children. Ideally, the interview should occur outside of the context of the violence, for example, outside the home where the abuse has happened. Betsy McAllister Groves, Elizabeth Roberts, and Maxine Weinreb describe the ideal interview space in their Shelter from the Storm curriculum. They describe a room that is set up like a living room or playroom with comfortable seating. Having the room child-proof with age-appropriate toys and child-sized furniture are also key in making the child feel comfortable disclosing sensitive information to you. Paulette and Davis suggest that toys should be racially diverse and promote creative expression, such as drawing and writing utensils, puppets, and modeling clay. They also suggest that having too many toys in a room can be overwhelming, and that when interviewing older children, toys should not be as prominent to avoid the perception that they are being treated like a baby or young child. Think about the following question and what you would do in this situation. What if you cannot interview the child alone? For example, if you're doing in-home interviewing and the parent is hovering or not allowing the child to have his own space. Betsy McAllister Groves is a licensed clinical social worker. She is the founding director of the Child Witness to Violence Project at Boston Medical Center and an associate professor of pediatrics at Boston University School of Medicine. In 2002, Groves published a book titled Children Who See Too Much: Lessons from the Child Witness to Violence Project. According to Groves, when confronted with this situation, the first question to think about is, why is this parent reluctant to leave the area or have me interview this child? It is important to assess the possible reasons, which may include the following. What is the age of the child? A parent may be reluctant to leave a young child with somebody they do not know, particularly to talk about an emotionally sensitive topic, and the child may demonstrate anxiety or wariness about being left alone. What is the parent's and child's understanding of the purpose of the interview? What have they been told? Do they understand what will happen during the interview? Is the child fearful of talking about family business? Has the child directly been told not to talk to the interviewer? Another possible reason may be direct interference by a parent who wants to hear what the child is saying or does not want the child to talk about certain things. Do not compromise the child's psychological and physical safety by putting pressure on the child to talk when he or she is not comfortable doing so, or when you are concerned that a parent may be intimidating or interfering with the interview. If you're in doubt about the safety of the situation, do not interview the child. Gather as much information as possible from other sources and note in your report that you were not able to interview the child and your assessment of the reasons the interview did not occur. To read Betsy McAllister Groves' full response, please click on the link under her picture. When you have finished reading her thoughts, come back to the screen and click on the arrow to advance to the next slide. We will go over the specific wording of questions later in this module and provide some examples, but it's important to remember that any interview questions are a guide and should be changed in order to meet the developmental age of the child being interviewed. There are no absolute rules for age-appropriate questions. The Child Interviewer's Guidebook by Wendy Berg and colleagues provides basic guidelines for child interviews. They suggest using short and simple sentences that contain only one idea and to try to keep sentences between 3 to 5 words. You can shorten sentences by removing unnecessary clauses. For example, can you tell me and do you remember? These clauses also elicit yes or no responses from children. It's better to use open-ended questions such as describe to me or prompts like tell me more about that. You also want to make sure the child understands certain words that you are using before you ask a question. Young children have a difficult time with why questions. 7 to 10-year-olds may be able to answer them about their own behavior, and 10 to 13-year-olds may be able to answer about other people's behavior. An example of a why question that may be appropriate for 7 to 10-year-olds is, why did you leave the house? Another example for older children who can answer about other people's behavior is, why do you think your dad did that? Older children are more likely to be guarded about violence in their families. As previously mentioned, children may have been told directly not to talk about the violence. The Child Interviewer's Guidebook provides a comprehensive overview of age-appropriate strategies. The full reference is included in the reading list. After introducing yourself and reviewing your role and confidentiality, establish the focus of the interview. For example, tell the child that you have talked to a lot of children that have gone through similar experiences, or that you are trying to understand what it was like to go through what they're going through. You should offer the child an overview of what you plan to do in the interview. By doing all of this, you let the child know that they are not alone, and you clearly establish what you are going to ask about. Hopefully this will add some predictability to the interview about which the child may be very anxious. Children will sometimes align themselves with the abusive adult and be reluctant to say anything negative or acknowledge any wrongdoing. This loyalty must be respected. Over time, in the context of a relationship with the child, you may be able to gain more information. If you do not have the opportunity to develop a relationship with the child or family before your assessment is completed, which is often the case with child welfare investigators, this can prove to be a significant barrier to your work. Using other interview strategies, including standardized instruments or structured interviews, may help facilitate the process of gathering the information that you need. Framing the interview in the context of concern for the family or child well-being is important. You will want to clarify your role as one of a helping person that wants to help build on the strengths of the family to make them as strong as they can be. In the end, however, you should respect the boundaries a child is trying to establish on information provided and move at the child's pace of disclosure. Children may be reluctant to separate from parents for an interview. Although conducting the interview alone with the child is ideal, it can be destructive to your relationship with the child to try to force them to go with you. Paulette and Davis point out that this can be especially frightening for a child who has experienced domestic violence. They suggest that the interviewer give the child permission to leave the interview at any time to check in with their parents. You should discuss this with parents before the interview so that they are available if the child seeks them out. Paulette and Davis point out that this can help decrease the child's anxiety. Lastly, don't make promises you can't keep. Keep this in mind as you are reviewing confidentiality with the child. Violating any promises may destroy the child's trust and remove the safety a child may feel when they are with you. Having a child engage in creative play before the interview can help break the ice, relieve anxiety, and establish trust. This training provides a very brief overview of this technique and how it is used by some practitioners in the field. For a more detailed description, look to the sources listed on the screen. The full references are also included in the reading list. Generally, you would ask the child to draw a picture about which he or she could tell a story. You should reassure the child that the quality of the picture or story does not matter. It's the content that matters. Some children will be hesitant and resistant to engaging in this activity, but most will eventually participate. A child's resistance should be respected, and you should move on to other activities if the child does not want to participate in this one. Alternatively, you can also ask the child to draw a picture of their family and tell the interview about their family. By asking further questions about the story and picture, references to traumatic events may come out. This activity also helps set the stage for a more direct interview later on where you will ask further questions about violent incidents. To transition into a more direct interview, you can take a part of the story and relate it back to the information you have about the violence the child may have experienced. If the child makes a direct reference to the violence in the initial play activity, the interviewer can use it to transition into a more direct interview. The following is a case example of how to use a child's drawing to start an interview. This example comes from Shelter from the Storm, a curriculum for mental health clinicians by Betsy McAllister Groves, Elizabeth Roberts, and Maxine Weinreb. This is a story about how a trained professional used this technique. This is intended to provide an example, not a training about how you would use this. If you are interested in using this technique with children, please refer to Groves et al. Manual for more information and further trainings. When you are finished reading the text on the screen, click Next to advance to the next section of this presentation. As we said earlier, open-ended questions are the best to use in an assessment interview since they do not lead the child and allow them room to tell their story. You have probably learned this in your professional training, but we want to emphasize it again here. Open-ended questions start with who, what, when, where, and how. These types of questions allow a free-running narrative. You can also use open-ended follow-up questions such as tell me more about that or what happened next. Children are able to recall and retell information when they are asked open-ended questions, however, not as well as adults. The younger the child, the less information they will be able to recall. Younger children will benefit from more focused questions. For example, you may want to gauge how a child feels about the abusive parent, and so you could ask a series of questions about that particular parent. Multiple choice questions can be used as well. They are more closed and open-ended or focused questions, but can be helpful when a child is struggling to narrate their story. For example, were you in the same room, a different room in the house, or somewhere else when you heard your dad hit your mom? It is important not to use leading interview techniques as they do not allow a child to tell their story and can lead to inaccurate disclosures. A handout is available for you to print and then use to follow along through this next section of the training. This handout is titled Sample Assessment Questions, and you can download and print it by clicking the link on the screen. You need to have the Adobe Acrobat Reader installed on your computer. If you don't have Acrobat, you can download it for free by clicking the link on the screen. This handout contains example questions for each area of assessment. These are only sample questions to help guide you in formulating your own questions to use with children. Questions should be tailored to the age of the child you are interviewing and to their specific situation and the context in which you are working. There is also a link on this page to the Child Welfare Information Gateway. On this website, you can find assessment questions developed as part of their training for child welfare workers on assessing child exposure to domestic violence. When you have finished downloading the handout and exploring the website, click Next to advance to the next screen. Abuse can be physical, sexual, and/or emotional. This includes physical and sexual violence such as hitting, pushing, and forcing sexual acts, but it also includes emotional maltreatment by preventing a partner from seeing friends or engaging in activities, monitoring her daily contacts, controlling or manipulating her access to money, name-calling, denigrating her, and the like. One tool for understanding all these types of abuse is the Power and Control Wheel, first developed by the Duluth Domestic Abuse Intervention Project. The wheel, shown on this slide, is bounded by physical and sexual violence around the outside. Within this band of violence are other forms of abuse that become all the more powerful when real or threatened violence is present. All of these are seen in this model as strategies being used to gain power and control over another person. This wheel helps one think about the different types of abuse to which a child may have been exposed. Reports of the abuse may be difficult to ascertain from very young children, but you can get a general impression from them. You may want to try using a multiple choice question to help younger children focus their responses. Please click the link on this screen to take you to an online gallery of various power and control wheels that view the same information from a different perspective. When you look at the various wheels on this website, you may want to print a copy of the Power and Control Wheel to use as a reference in your practice. When assessing the abuse to which the child has been exposed, there are 4 factors that should, at a minimum, be included in your assessment. They include the types of violence existing in the child's home, the severity of the violence, the frequency of the violence, and the chronicity of the violence, or how long it's been going on. Using direct questions about the type of violence in the home is useful since children are often reluctant to talk about it. Descriptions from the Power and Control Wheels should help you think about the various tactics which are used by adults who batter and can help you formulate questions and recognize abusive tactics. The questions from the Child Exposure to Domestic Violence Scale, which assess these 4 factors, are included in the handout you just printed. These questions were intended to be used in a paper and pencil tool with children aged 10 to 16. These questions can be adapted for use with children of various ages in your practice. Understanding how children have experienced or come to know about the violence in the home is important to our understanding of their story and interpretation of the events. As previously discussed, child exposure involves much more than seeing or hearing. Children are also exposed to the aftermath of violent events, for example, seeing the police come to the house, seeing broken objects or bruises on a parent, and going in a police car to a shelter. All of these may be traumatic events that contribute to how a child constructs their understanding of the violence and responds to its occurrence now and in the future. Understanding how a child has been exposed to violence and how they understand it helps us understand the level of trauma they have experienced. It is not, however, accurate to assume that a child who did not see the violent event but did see the aftermath is less traumatized than a child who was present in the same room when the violence occurred. Escaping from the violent incident may be a child's coping mechanism and strategy to remain safe. Remember that in Jamie's story, she recounted seeing blood on the steps of her home as a child, but she did not actually see the violent incident. She also reports that she often saw the aftermath in the form of physical injuries to her mother. Another factor to consider when assessing exposure is how a child has been actively involved in the violent events. Children can be involved in a variety of ways. They can be used by the abusive partner to control the victim. Abusive partners may threaten to take children away or hurt them if the victim leaves or doesn't do what the abusive partner wants. Jeffrey Edleson and colleagues found that women experiencing more severe violence at a higher frequency reported that their children intervened more often. They also found that children intervened more often when the batterer was not a biological parent. Family stability was a major factor in predicting a child's involvement in violent incidents. Children whose mothers were not married, less educated, and living in transitional housing were more likely to intervene. Jamie's story is an example of a child intervening in violence. At the age of 3, Jamie intervened while her stepfather was threatening her mother with a knife. She did so by distracting him and asking him to help her to bed. An analysis of police arrest data by John Fantuzzo and his colleagues found that children ages 0 to 5 years were significantly more likely to be present during single and reoccurring domestic violence incidents. Other studies have found, like Jamie's experience, that children's responses to violent events appear to vary with age. But even children ages 1 to 2.5 years respond to angry conflict that includes physical attacks with negative emotions and efforts to become actively involved in the conflicts. Understanding how the child is coping is important because it can help to indicate what services might be most helpful to the child, as well as inform your assessment as to the child's overall risk and well-being. As stated earlier, coping strategies will vary with the age of the child. Peled found that children tend to use more emotion-focused coping strategies, which include attempts to regulate emotions and normalize the violence, versus problem-focused strategies such as intervening in or distracting themselves from the violence. Other emotion-focused coping strategies include minimizing the violence, wishing the violence away, and forgiving the adult who is abusive. Garcia-O'Hearn and colleagues found that based on the parents' reports, children from high-conflict homes characterized by physical violence were more likely to leave the room, but also appeared more sad, angry, and frightened than other children who witnessed marital conflict without physical violence. You may observe some children acting reckless, defiant, aggressive, numb, social withdrawal, constricted exploration, separation anxiety, and new fears developing. You may want to follow up with a caregiver to find out if there have been any changes in behavior that correspond with violent events, escalating violence, or other changes in the family violence dynamics. In Jamie's story, she talks about how her family never talked about the violence that was occurring in the home, even though they saw blood on the steps to their home every day as a reminder of the terrifying events that had occurred. In adulthood, Jamie described having no contact with her mother. These are examples of using avoidance as a coping mechanism to deal with the trauma of domestic violence. It is important to remember that domestic violence represents only one part of this child's experience. It may be something that is causing significant concern for the child, but that does not mean that this child or the family does not have any strengths and protective factors at play. Strengths are the foundation on which to build your intervention. By only focusing on the deficits of a family in your interview with the child, you may leave them feeling hopeless and guilty, among other emotions. By taking time to focus on the strengths and encouraging a child to talk about the positives they see in their family, you give them an opportunity to share a comprehensive and holistic picture of their lives. Additionally, this may give the child an opportunity to explore their own strengths that they can build on. Please follow the link on this page to a document published by the National Online Resource Center on Violence Against Women. This article discusses the various protective factors associated with adult victims of domestic violence. Ending the interview on a positive note, if possible, is considered best practice. One way to do this is to focus on strengths-based questions like those we just covered. You may also want to ask about other things in the child's life. Betsy McAllister Groves and colleagues provide the example question, "What is your favorite thing to do with your parent?" You can also encourage the child to ask questions. Finally, let the child know what will likely happen next. They often live in chaotic and uncertain worlds, so your clarity on what to expect next will be important to a child's sense of safety with you. If you are going to speak with a parent or caregiver directly after the interview with the child, be sure to let the child know what you will and will not share with that person. This is a good time to revisit your limits to confidentiality. In this training module, you learned about the goals and purpose of completing a comprehensive assessment of children exposed to domestic violence. We covered techniques that can help you understand the child's story, the meaning they give to the violence, and their coping mechanisms and strengths. In addition, we covered some basic interviewing techniques.